Hello, everyone. Welcome to Retire with Style. I'm Alex, and I'm here with my good buddy Wade, and we are continuing our arc on long-term care. And we have another guest, McLean's very own Jason Rizkallah. As they say, no one beats the Riz.
He's got Riz. It's a slang of the day.
Welcome. Yeah, right. Welcome, Jason, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you guys for having me on here. I really
All
appreciate it.
right, and the honor's ours. And just a little recap. You've been on. You're one of our recurring guests. We had, we're having a few advisors from McLean join us simply because, as I said in an episode previous, in theory, theory and practice go together. In practice, they don't. And so we think it's very important, even though Wade and I can just talk about, the ins and outs of long-term care from what the what the rules say, if you will. You have a lot of wisdom from working with clients, and we always think that's important. And so we wanted to give as much attention to like the real reality of things and what you would do from a spider sense standpoint and how you blend that with financial planning best practices. And with that, I'll let Wade kick it off.
Yeah. So we're excited to talk to you about that practical side of long-term care and examples you have about working with clients to determine a long-term care plan. I think you've got some interesting cases there that we can talk about, as well as just the general, how do you actually incorporate long-term care into a financial plan? So I don't know the best place. Maybe a story is the best place to start. If you kind of walk us through an example where working with a client thinking about long-term care insurance options, uh, an experience with where that ultimately was successful.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, there's a few stories that actually come to mind right off the forefront. One very predominant one, because this one had an unexpected kind of twist to it, if you will. I was working with clients in financial planning capacity, and very well-to-do clients, very educated. And we were talking about long-term care and insurance coverages in general. Just life insurance, health insurance, and long-term care, of course, came into the equation, and we were discussing that. And these folks were in generally really good health. I wouldn't say top notch, if you will, but they were in good health. They took care of themselves in all the proper ways. So long-term care was kind of a side thought for them, at least initially. Something that would happen perhaps 30 years down the line or something of that nature. They were in their mid 50s. So when most people think of long-term care, they're thinking of something that occurs much later in life. And maybe for the majority of folks, that is the case, but it certainly isn't the case for everybody, in that matter. So we were discussing this topic of long-term care, and initially it was something that they didn't feel that maybe held value to their overall plan or to their financial situation, as it was so far down the line and unpredictable as to whether they would need it or not. Certainly both of them needing it or not. But we continued the conversation, and ultimately we decided for them that it would be best to get some coverages, within it. And there's a variety of different ways you can get long-term care coverage. And for them, we chose a specific option that fit their situation very well. Well, lo and behold, the plan kind of dictated that this would probably, if at all, come into use later on in life. A few years pass, and actually, an unexpected event occurred where the wife slipped on ice on their front stairs and hit her head. And due to that injury, she actually had to be admitted to a care facility, which the long-term care
Wow.
policy came in. Yes, I mean unexpectedly, completely out of the blue, much earlier than expected. But that
Yeah, man.
long-term care policy came in and actually provided benefits for that care that happened just a few years later. Something that completely out of left field. And that example always resonates with me when I'm speaking with folks, because one, it's a real life example. This truly happened to somebody, right? It isn't a fabricated or hypothetical, that could happen. That sometimes can come into the conversations with insurances like, well, maybe, or perhaps, or there's a chance. I mean, this actually happened, and no way to plan around that otherwise. But the policy came in, provided coverage, well appreciated coverage for them, and she was able to get the care that she needed with those assets. but a clear example of when unexpected events happen. Things do occur, in life that we obviously can't plan for or plan around. But it can add assurance to have these types of insurance policies in place to help protect against, these types of events from happening. And this all came about from an otherwise kind of successful plan, if you will, a plan that was successful without this type of coverage, for the long term, not a glaring like need or desire for it,
Yeah.
but one that provided a benefit nonetheless.
Yeah, and could you talk a little bit about what kind of insurance they were able to use in that case? Because we have this whole ongoing discussion around traditional long-term care insurance policies are
Yeah.
getting more and more expensive. As if we usually think of insurance for a low probability, high cost event, long-term care is more of a high probability, high cost event. So
Yeah.
there's the hybrid policies, and I think that's a situation where you were able to find a hybrid policy for this particular case.
That is correct. So we identified that the hybrid policy, which was a combination of a life insurance and a long-term care policy together, so it offered a death benefit and a long-term care benefit in one package, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually funded with a lump sum, of assets that were placed into it, and based off of that amount of the lump sum was where those benefits kind of were derived or calculated from. So depositing the assets to it and then generating the benefits that would be paid out under those circumstances from it. So the benefits were known ahead of time, what they would be, at the time, as it played out over time.
Hmm.
And it definitely added value for them. One, because it didn't participate in the kind of traditional long-term care, where you have a policy, you pay premiums annually, and then they adjust premiums perhaps, down the road,
Mm-hmm.
and it can come very costly very quickly. Although that's still a very good way to get the benefit, it's more less predictable, if I can use that term, where what you're going to pay for this coverage, in the long term. While those types of policies, obviously it's a lump sum that funds it. Your cost is already taken care of with that amount. So that was the policy that we identified was best for them, and it worked out to their favor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned that's kind of on the general point about why hybrid policies, like generally combining life insurance with long-term care, have become more popular.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the unpredictable premiums, whereas with traditional long-term care insurance, we've seen huge premium hikes over time that make the policies less affordable. And also behaviorally, there's that use it or lose it mentality, which
Yep.
is often true with most types of insurance, where if you don't have a claim, you paid premiums for that insurance that ultimately was not realized. But with the hybrid policies, behaviorally, I think people can appreciate it's life insurance. It's if you got a pure life standalone life insurance, it probably would have had better terms, but at least you have long-term care protection, and if you don't need it, you still have the life insurance death benefit at the end.
It's very attractive, to many folks, because, like as Wade said, the benefit will be used one way or the other, there.
Mm-hmm.
And Jason, without identifiables and things like that, and just curious how the story ended up, because obviously there's this, whew, Dodge. Obviously, you always wish the best for the lady that slipped and everything like that. But all things, in consideration of that, how is that progressing along with that person?
Yes, well, very nice. She was able to get out of that care facility, right? So she got better and was able to leave it in time for the benefit to not run its course, right? So
Gotcha.
that was good. So she stayed there within the benefit base. The nice part about it is that it helped preserve a lot of their assets that were otherwise going to be used to fund their retirement over the long term. And
Mm-hmm.
as planners, we know that money you use at the beginning of retirement has a greater effect, right, than money used later on. So the fact that this happened so early in their lives, to have that kind of financial hit to their overall net worth, it would have had significant repercussions throughout the length of their plan, because that upfront money was not planned to be spent at that time. It was planned to be stretched over their
Yeah,
retirement.
absolutely.
So it helped to preserve a great deal of their wealth that they were able to then continue on with retirement, as it should. Small tweaks had to be made to it, but nonetheless, it didn't derail them. It didn't, ruin what would otherwise be a successful retirement.
And on orders of magnitude, this would have been a significant, like, yearly expense
Yes,
otherwise.
yes. She was in there for 3 years. The last year was, not quite the full year. So I'll say 2.5
Yeah,
if I wanted to be a little
yeah,
bit
yeah.
more. Yeah. So it was, a lengthy event. It wasn't just in there for a few months and out, type of situation.
Wade, I started thinking when Jason was talking about this, like the fragile decade, but nothing to do with the stock market. It's like an unexpected
Yeah.
huge expense as soon as you retire can kind of have the
Yeah.
same effect, right?
But amplifies sequence risk if you have to take a large distribution early on in retirement.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
thing.
Okay. No, and so you were talking about the planning. How do you incorporate when you're doing for those as well scoring at home consumers? What advice would you give them? Well, two things. How do you incorporate it into the planning that we do at McLean? Someone comes in, yeah, how do you account for long-term care? Do you go right to the hybrids? Do you go to the regular policies? Whatever. I don't want to lead it. You know what you're doing. The other piece is if for someone scoring at home, what advice would you give them in how they think about it when they're doing their Excel calculation planning?
Sure.
That kind of thing. And what could be some gremlins that they may not be looking at that you take into consideration when you're modeling for potential long-term care?
Absolutely. Happy to kind of further elaborate on those. So when it comes to our approach within planning for individuals, we work in long-term care events for every financial plan that we generate for individuals because, as Wade said, high probability, right, that this will occur, and high cost for both. So when you have those two factors coming in, it better be something that's included, in your
But
plan.
long-term care event is different than long-term care insurance.
Correct, correct.
Or
So what we do is we actually stress test folks' plans for long-term care to see what happens when these events occur. What is the effect it has on somebody's financial plan success? Okay, as a result of this. Now, this is long-term care events. That helps us to then see the impact it has to their situation without coverage, right? Without coverage. And the comfort level with that, with the outcome from that analysis, whether it's good or bad, we present that to the client as saying, look, this is what you're exposed to right now, potentially, should this event happen to you, right? Is that something you're comfortable with or not? Self-insuring if you want to. Then oftentimes we'll work in a plan that includes whatever we identify as a type of policy that would be best for them as far as the features of it, how it would
yeah, yeah.
work. But we show a plan using long-term care insurance, in the event that happens. And you can very clearly see, distinguish the differences between, okay, if I have this coverage, including the cost of the coverage, right, into the expenses, because that's obviously something we need to do, versus not having it, and compare. Just look at it and compare very easily what happens in your situation. That's a common approach that we take with individuals to just clearly map out what it would look like without the coverage in this event happening versus having the coverage in the event occurring for them. Now, the trickiness that comes with that is, as with my example that I shared earlier, we don't know the timing of when this event could occur. Right now, again, for most folks, it will happen later on in life, but that's not a certainty for everybody. And with the high cost of this type of event happening and the different times it can happen at, I mean, that in itself is something that's very hard to kind of plan around from a planning perspective. You can run different scenarios and see what would happen, but we know it's not going to work out that way. It's going to be something different than what essentially appears on paper. So what we do, just as a default, is that
Yeah.
we use very specific information as far as where the client lives at the time the event is to occur. And when we plan it in towards the end of life, because that's when it's potentially going to be the most expensive for you after inflation kicks in all these years. Now we also increase, and this can help with folks that are doing self-planning on an Excel spreadsheet, perhaps, as Alex said, the inflation rate that you use for this, right? We double the kind of normal standard general inflation rate is what we use in ours. So if we're using a 3% inflation rate in plan, we're going to use 6% on that long-term care side. If we're using 2.5, we're going to use 5, just as a precaution for that, because we do realize the cost of that inflates at a much higher pace than general inflation does. So that's how we account for the rise in costs in it. The event happening, we have it occur towards the end of life because, again, that's when it could inflate to its most. And again, the probability of it happening later on in life is more likely than it happening sooner, even though it may, but still, as best as we can plan out, that's what we do. We push it out towards the end of life when it's at its highest cost for folks. But of course, that can be moved around, as needed. But we use where you're going to be living at the time that event happens. So if you're living in, XYZ state today, and you're looking at the average, private nursing home care, that's what we base it off of, which is the more expensive type of care, but the more preferred, for most folks.
Hmm.
Then, you might be looking at $100,000, just using just a very general example here. But if you move to a different state, that could be 130, 140, even 150,
Yeah, there's
160,
Wow.
huge variations, right? The
Yes.
the cheapest areas that Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri,
Hmm.
Texas. Once you get into the northeast part of the U.S., you can be looking at double the price in
Or
many
West
cases.
Coast. Yeah,
Or
right.
West Coast.
California is very
So
expensive for it.
hang on, Wade's audio is not coming in clearly. So he typed in a question. Is it better to be in a red state or a blue state?
No
Do you want?
No,
politics here.
no, 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 no. Do not answer that. I don't care. I don't care what you think about
Yeah.
that.
um,
No, it varies. The point is, it
yeah,
varies on state, and there you go. One thing you asked that I was thinking about here is when you're running the numbers and if people can self-insure or not. You kind of hinted towards it. Uh, if they can self-insure and let's say the assumed cost is $500,000. I'm making this up, right?
sure.
The assumed all-in cost if something were to happen, it'd be $500,000.
And you're talking about in today's dollars, the
Yeah,
lump
in
sum
today's
for the.
dollar. Yeah, yeah. Versus if they're not planning on self-insure, they're going to get long-term care, and that long-term care is going to, let's say your all-in cost would be 400 grand, 450 grand, something that's a little less, right, than the all-in cost. How do how do people tend to react to that? Where they can self-insure, it'll be a little more, but the odds maybe, yes, high probability and this and that, but maybe they're hoping they get a heart attack, and they're
Hmm.
done. They get a heart attack in their sleep and they're done. That not to be morbid, but I'm being morbid, I guess. How does that play into folks' heads in terms of, yes, they can afford the self-insurance, but it may cost a little bit more than if they get the policy. So where do you find them kind of tilting or not, or what would you suggest?
When it comes to a scenario like that, where the difference is not significant, right, between the two, if you will, a lot
Hey,
of it
speak
comes
for
up.
yourself. It's not your 100 grand. No.
Yeah, right. Easier to say that about
Look at
other
this
folks' money.
guy.
uh, uh, I would say it really comes down to preference, for
All
many
right.
folks, and whether or not this is something they see value in beyond just the numbers, but in what it provides, and maybe the security and safety that the insurance provides over not doing it. I think that has a lot to do with whether or not it's worth moving forward with some type of policy.
Does that have a stronger pull from a psychological valence standpoint, what they prefer versus the cost? Obviously, cost, there's a reality component of things. So
Hmm.
I respect that, and from a cost standpoint. But let's say there's there's the ability to go either way, then cost becomes significantly less important as opposed to what it what it solves for them psychologically.
You know, um, I think initially the reservation, perhaps against getting insurance, long-term care insurance specifically, is the cost. But there's more to it than that once you really start to kind of dig deeper, right? Because even in cases where maybe I've worked with folks that have said, hey, it's too expensive, I'm not going to get that kind of coverage. And then when you work through it, you come up with, oh, well, actually, it's compared to what you could be paying out of pocket, right?
Yeah.
It's actually much cheaper, right? It's usually not as close as your example. It's usually much further apart, right?
I was purposely trying to get
Yeah,
something close, but yeah, yeah, yeah.
but even at that case, they still don't move forward with the policy, right? Even though the cost clearly outweighed what you would be spending out of pocket, for it.
Really?
Yeah, so there's much more to it than just the cost, even though that might be the initial, kind of feeling. you got to go deeper and figure out, is this something that adds value or not, based on what the client is looking for, and what they're looking for. Now, ultimately, sometimes we still recommend the policies, and they're not implemented, and that's up to the clients to decide that. But as planners, we've identified it and at least presented it as options that should be considered.
And then part of that too could just relate to like within the retirement income style awareness, the true liquidity preference, which is this idea that you have to have assets earmarked for different uses. And part of that means if you have a contingency, if we're talking about this $500,000 potential contingency, well, you have to have $500,000 set aside as reserve assets.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're, depending on how you're going to invest those, just having, if you feel like you have to keep that in cash, even though the long-term care event may be in the distant future, or at least the odds are it's in the more distant future, how are you going to invest those funds? That could be a consideration. I think two other points too about long-term care insurance, that why someone might consider that. The issue is just the idea, maybe with a blended family, it might be more relevant of, with insurance, that care will be accessible and available. Without insurance, people might start to worry, well, what if I spend this money? Am I spending my children's inheritance and so forth? And so I think that can be potentially, I don't know if you've seen cases like this, a draw towards considering insurance. And then also just the idea of the care coordinator benefit that a lot of insurance policies have, where if you need care, there's a professional who will help find that care
Mm-hmm.
for the individual. Do you have any experiences with those kinds of features of insurance?
When it comes to preserving the assets, yes, like from a legacy standpoint, that's certainly one. When it comes to the assistance of, finding an appropriate caregiver, I don't have so much experience with that, but that would add value for folks that obviously when you're naturally, right, if you're starting to work your way towards this type of facility, many times you can start to have cognitive issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your own
Right.
ability to locate somebody, it could be very difficult if you don't have a support, family support as an example, helping you do it, right? So having those types of services available to you can add extreme value, at that point, for that. And that I do actually have a lot of experience with, working with individuals that start to develop cognitive issues, right, and the assistance with it that's necessary. So having that kind of support on a policy, I mean, would certainly add a lot of value.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is where the practical side, I think a lot of policies have that sort of
Mm-hmm.
care coordinator provision included. Have you seen, like, is there a number of policies out there that don't have that feature? So it's something people might want to watch out for.
Yeah, I mean, that would certainly be something to inquire about, right? When you're starting to
Mm-hmm.
narrow down who the provider is going to be, if that's something that is inclusive in the policy or not. Because I have seen policies with it, seen it without it, so
Okay.
making sure that it is what's there, if that's what you want, and why not have that, right? If you can, um, for it. But yeah, I've seen policies both ways, with it.
Great.
No, that's good. And so, when you're doing it for the planning, you run it with money. You assume some event's going to hit towards the end, and then you just effectively run a Monte Carlo and figure out, does it bankrupt the portfolio or not, et cetera, et cetera. Correct?
That is
And
correct.
then,
Yes.
eh, all right, and then to Wade's point, I think what you're saying with true liquidity for that I want people to sort of take home is that there's potentially two issues. If they're just taking, let's say, a sustainable withdrawal rate from a portfolio and they're banking on technical liquidity, not true liquidity, is that they're going to be hesitant that, hey, I'm using my portfolio to fund my essential expenses, but I have to leave a little because I don't want to run out of money for essential expenses. But then they're going to have to put another sleeve in that's specific for long-term care. That has nothing to do with just funding essential expenses. Correct? And so then, to your point, I mean, you're not utilizing your assets efficiently, is
Hmm.
what you're getting at. Correct, Wade? Jason?
Yes, it's exactly what Wade said, right? When you have this reserve asset, which is essentially would have to be set up, from day one, really, because you don't know when this
Yeah.
event would happen. And now all of a sudden that asset isn't It has to be safe, right? It has to be accessible. So
Yeah.
you start to lose efficiencies, yeah, with how you can invest and you're actually how you're utilizing your assets throughout retirement.
Okay. And how do you see it, all things being equal? What do you see playing out in the financial plan? That not from an Excel optimization standpoint, not from a preference standpoint. What do you what do your spider senses tell you? You know, based on all the plans that you've done with regards to long-term care, does insurance tend to be a little more economically optimal or self-insurance?
It varies actually. If
That's
I
fine.
yeah, if I were to put hard numbers on it, honestly, I know this sounds like a cliche answer, but it's 50-50. You know, I mean, it
That's
works out.
good. That
Yeah.
means more reason to do a plan, but go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's not leaning one way or the other.
Yeah.
I can tell you from a implementation standpoint, I think more folks opt to not get the coverage than get it, right?
Hmm.
So from an implementation standpoint, it definitely is the majority of folks do not purchase the insurance, even
How,
if the numbers work out, to where it does support buying it.
how much of
Or
that do you
they may
think?
not be eligible they with the
That's
underwriting.
the whole other side of it.
That's
Yeah,
exactly where
that's
I was getting at.
hmm so
What
pre-existing
does that mean, though?
conditions.
But just, yeah, exactly. What does that mean? Or better yet, can you, okay, let's say the planning, all right, long-term care is a viable option. What are the steps that they have to go through to sign on the dotted line to make the
Sure.
policy alive? And what are the hurdles in those nodes that people kind of fall back on, be it inertia, be it the pre-existing conditions, etc.
Yes, that's the underwriting process for long-term care is not a fun one, for most folks, especially speaking in the traditional sense of coverage. And the first step is one, identifying the amount of coverage that you're looking for, right? That you're looking to obtain, and how you want it structured with that. Certain waiting periods to be able to activate the benefits. Once the benefits kick in, what are they going to cover, for how long, for how much? Once all that's been kind of worked out through the plan, right? Like how that ultimately would work for you. Then you kind of cast the net out to the providers and see what comes back on a general kind of quote, if you will, of policy coverage, right? With very general information about your health. You just fall into different categories initially on the first step. Once you get those quotes back, then you will look down and see, okay, these are the providers that are willing to do business in this space, okay, which unfortunately has been getting less and less, over the years. So there's like less competition for it. There's less insurance companies that are willing to do it. This works the same for couples too. I mean, because these people are going to each do their own. Now, sometimes there can be group like a couple's discount, if you go with the same provider, but that's all worked out once you have like the providers kind of in front of you and what you're looking at, and some general questions you can start to do to narrow down that list. Now,
You said couples discount, and I want to get into that a little
yes,
later, just the whole husband wife spouse thing. But go on,
sure, uh-huh.
finish your.
Yeah, yeah, we can definitely touch on that. So once, let's say you've narrowed it down to the two, different providers, or even one, if there's a clear difference, when you see the list of who's willing to offer the insurance in that space for what the parameters that you set in, sometimes you can narrow it down to one provider very easily, sometimes not, right? Sometimes there's still, two that you're kind of deciding between, or even three. It just depends on that. Then the once you've identified the one that you want to go with, you go and fill out an application for it, and that kind of kickstarts everything with that company. There's an underwriting process that you go through that involves a lot of questions being answered, medical records, things like this of that nature. They dive deep into kind of how are you today, what has already been on the record for you, pre-existing conditions. That is a term that is used a lot in healthcare insurance, but
Hmm.
also transfers over here. And that can be a lengthy process. That can vary though from company to company. What one
And
company,
lengthy means 3 months, 6 months, a
e-
year.
e- not a year, I wouldn't say
I
that,
know.
but
I
yeah,
it's for people listening in. I want
fair
to
enough.
help them
Uh,
level set.
yeah, I would say 3-4 months, on average. Again, sometimes quicker, sometimes a little bit longer. Just again, depends, right? Like what they uncover, what they're asking about, how many times they go back to you for information or not. That all varies and comes into play. But basically, there are some very common underwriting questions that you'll find at almost every, insurer. And then sometimes you'll find ones that ask you questions that other ones don't, right? And it's part of their process for it. But basically, when you work with a knowledgeable long-term care insurance specialist, based off of information that they've gathered from you at that point of filling out an application, they should be able to help narrow down, if have a good sense at least. Hey, does this have a chance of being approved or rejected or what? Because you don't want to be declined, at the end of the day, as much as you can
Yeah.
avoid it. And it's a lot of time, effort, and stuff that's put into that. Plus, that's also a question. Some carriers will ask you, "Have you ever been declined, for coverage?" And so you want to avoid that. And working with a knowledgeable long-term care specialist can help with that. You're not just throwing your kind of information out there to a bunch of companies and letting them decide things. You're working with somebody that has seen things before and knows, okay, you have this kind of condition. We don't want to go with this company. We want to maybe perhaps go with this one, over here. That's very important. I didn't mention that at the very onset, but that's what's important about working with a long-term care professional that is
Well, I
experienced.
think I think your point about the simple question of have you ever been previously denied?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
almost like cheating.
yeah. I
It's
know.
almost like cheating for that guy. They're using the due diligence of the previous firm, It's like, come on, man. But
Piggybacking. Yeah.
no, but within the purview of an advisor, it shows you how specialized this is.
Hmm.
So if we gets to that point, what you would do is bring in effectively a specific expert on long-term care to make
Yes.
sure you gives yourself the best chance of success to getting it in the first time. Because if
Yeah.
you don't, then you have a little bit of a scarlet letter on you.
You could have a little, blemish on your record, if you will, which it might not, it's not going to help you in the future, to have that. So, or even at that time. So yes, you're right. I mean, we identify the need, we identify kind of the coverage amounts, and that as planners, that's where we're taking it to. Once this step is being made to move forward with the coverage, we bring in a long-term care specialist into the picture, that knows those ins and outs of the different companies and what their offerings are to make sure that we're leading our clients in the most appropriate manner.
And by we, you mean McLean Asset Management.
Correct. McLean Asset
So
Management.
this is McLean has a long-term care professional that they reach out to whenever the need arises to
That's right.
talk about a
Yeah,
specific client case.
I believe it happens so much. I mean, last time I checked, we have one on retainer
Mhm.
kind of thing. So it's one of those that it's hard to keep up sometimes with the ins and outs. It's not even keeping up with the literature. It's just the actual business of
Policy.
long-term care. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Now, wait, when Jason was speaking, I started thinking, and maybe Jason, you can provide some insight here. You know how there's a self-selection bias for folks that get annuities, like a SPIA or something like that, right? So they're priced with the idea that, hey, if you want a SPIA, that's because you're probably in good health. And so, it's going to be priced accordingly relative to, as opposed to just the general population, if you will, because it self-selects. Now, you said, which I agree with, long-term care is a high probability, high cost event, regardless if you're healthy or sick, because
Sometimes the
everyone,
healthiest people are the ones who will need care more likely
yeah,
because they're going to
exactly.
live
That's what
long enough to need it.
Yep. Hmm.
Well, okay, and the unhealthy ones will have like not a
The
chronic
heart
thing,
attack.
but that's the
Yeah.
heart
Yeah.
attack
Hmm.
walking down the sidewalk. Okay, yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that part. I was just wondering if there's a bias in the pricing on that. Was where I was going with that. But
Adverse selection.
yeah, is there an adverse selection to that? But I'm not sure. Just thinking out loud.
No, it's a great point. Nothing that's been pointed out, at least, if that's the case. Like,
Yeah,
nothing that's been
yeah,
stated, if that is the case. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. And so, as we close out, is it fair to say the idea that you could make the case even before this arc. A lot of times, folks will say, "Oh, long-term care. Oh, they don't. People don't have those policies anymore. Don't have those policies anymore. They're too expensive." And they know something. They know about long-term care, but they kind of rule themselves out immediately simply because
Hmm.
they think the landscape has priced everyone out of that market. Is that how would you answer? How would you respond to somebody that just casually says that in consideration of today's market, in consideration of like a hybrid, etc.
Well, that is a very common thought that people have, right? That it's just too expensive now, and the benefits are not good. It's like this double negative,
Yeah.
right?
But then it becomes like this thing that if everyone thinks it, like they don't
Yeah.
challenge their assumptions is what I'm getting at. And so,
And I mean, there's no clearer way to look at that than to actually build it into somebody's situation and see, what happens, and then compare it to what is actually available as far as coverages go, right? And saying, here, look, this is it in action, rather than just
yeah,
news articles or headlines or things that are saying this. Yes, the market has gotten thinner, with some of these things, and have been some companies that have stopped doing long-term care that did it in the past. Um, okay, that's fine. The it's still an option here. There's still a market for it. There's still a need for it, and as long as that is the price, the price is going to be the price. But at the end of the day, it's how, your policy structured, how it's set up, and also due to the cost of traditional long-term care insurance, increasing, other policies like what we had mentioned earlier, hybrid policies have become, a little bit more of a popular option for folks to look at and consider. A lot of those paid up front type ones that I discussed with my clients earlier, with the story, have become very popular for that very reason. The cost you're going into it, and the benefit you're getting out of it should something happen, both on the life and long-term care side. These are all knowns going into it, which can ease a lot of the uncertainties, that Wade had spoken about even earlier about the pricing and that sort of thing, or the even, usage of it.
Yeah, and that's ultimately like with those hybrid policies. If you are just going to have your reserves in cash, sometimes the hybrid policies, if you end up not needing long-term care, so you're going to tap into the death benefit, ultimately it's going to imply a cash-like return over time. But if you do need long-term care, then you get the leverage on those dollars, and that's where you might see fit with the planning process, especially for someone who's not as comfortable investing those reserve assets for growth because they don't know when they might need them.
And sometimes, even the hybrid policies offer like a return of premium, type of things on them as well. That you don't want to go into it with that, right? Because you're going into it for the benefit, but at the same time,
yeah.
there's access if you do need it, for some strange event. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more, there's a lot of flexibilities that are being built around products now, and have been for some time. They don't really get the headlines, right? The headlines is the long-term care market is
It's terrible. Get out.
not worth it.
Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
leave it. Like annuities. Annuities got a bad rep for a while, right? I mean, they work great for the right situation, right? They're a really good fit for the right client in the right situation. And it's the same thing with long-term care policies.
I think it's great. All right. I'll ask you one more thing, and if Wade have something, feel free, man. But what what bubbles up that we haven't asked today that you think merits discussing? Since we're not going to invite you back for another long-term care discussion, so
Oh,
there'll be for other
I'm not
things.
invited back for no. I'm
Unload
just,
on us.
Long-term care discussion. We'll bring you back, obviously, but I mean, we got one whack at the cat here with you. So what sort of thing did you wish we asked that we didn't, or what could we have asked that we didn't that you think, hey, this would be interesting for your readers, for your listeners to hear?
well, we had started to touch on it a little bit, right? I'm not going to go into crazy detail with it, but there are policies of spouses that you guys can get
Oh,
together, right? And that one of you ultimately hits the benefit, or there's a benefit base for both of you, right? That can be
Oh, right,
shared.
shared.
Yeah, a shared benefit base, which is great, right? Because again, the high probability two people going, the probability of both people going in is pretty high, but certainly at least one is
one.
very high,
Yeah.
right? So it's just who it happens to be. Instead of having separate policies, paying separate premiums, things like that, you can have, perhaps something that's jointly held.
Even for paperwork, it's easier, I would
Yeah. Oh
imagine.
yeah, for sure, for sure. So that's something that can help with couples, get coverage in a way that maybe seem more practical, than the traditional route of each having their own for that. But I think that, I would say that, and again, this is something that was spoken about a little bit earlier, but just to reiterate it, that oftentimes long-term care is seen as something that is going to happen much later in life than today, right? So 30 years from now, 25 years from now, just again, speaking statistically, if you will, I don't like using statistics that much and things, but with this, most people are going to encounter these events later on in life. With that said, it is something you need to think about today, for that time. And that, I think, can sometimes lose sight of what do we want to do in retirement today, or what do we want to do with our lives today versus what could potentially, or most likely will happen later on. That's tomorrow's problem, not today's problem. And with long-term care, the planning should start today, with that, for the long-term.
Understood.
Yeah, I think that's something to just make sure that folks keep in mind when if they're doing their own planning, that's taken into consideration and put it in.
Yeah, the probability of needing care increases with age,
Yep.
but it's still non-zero at younger ages. So accidents happen, health-related things can happen at any age. So it's something you don't want to keep deferring. Plus, as we talked about, at some point you may no longer be able to pass through the underwriting.
That's another one. Yeah, is that at some point you might be uninsurable, from a long-term care perspective.
All right. That's a sobering way to end this episode. Thank you. Thank you very much for the good times, Jason.
The good news is there's still options out there, okay? The market is not dried up. It's there.
I'm gonna go have a drink, everybody. Day drinking at it's 2:51 p.m.
Thanks, Jason.
Now. Hello, darkness, my old friend. Yeah. All right. Wait. Any parting thoughts before you take us home?
No, I don't have anything else. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Jason. It was great getting some of those practical insights with a practicing financial advisor from McLean Asset Management who can bring us not just the theory, but the actual what goes on in the real world. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me. I really enjoy being on these with you guys, and always enjoy talking back and forth, and happy to share anything I can, that can help folks out.
Great. Yeah. And we'll have to bring you back on a less depressing topic.
All righty. All right, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.